Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing our series on teleological arguments for the existence of God. In our last video, we took a look at the watch argument for the existence of God. In this video, we're going to be looking at objections to the watch argument. If you don't know that argument, you should check out my previous video. Now, I outlined the argument as follows. Either nature or some of its parts have design-like properties are. They show evidence of being shaped by intention. Design-like properties are not producible by natural means. Anything which exhibits are must be a product of design. Therefore, there exists some parts of nature which are products of some design. Therefore, there exists some designer, God, that has shaped these things with intention. It's important to note that this argument, unlike the argument from analogy, is deductively valid. So, the only way we can object to it is to object to the truth of the premises, which is exactly what we're going to do in this video. So let's take a look at premise 1. Either nature or some of its parts have design-like properties are. They show evidence of being shaped by intention. Well, once again, this is going to hinge on what we say R is. In the last video, we looked at complexity and purpose as some possible R's. In this one, we're going to talk about two other R's that are often put out there by people supporting these arguments. Perhaps you want to say that design-like properties are clear geometric figures, having straight lines, right angles, perfect rectangles or cubes. These seem to be things that we see in man-made objects or designed objects. However, the problem is that light rays travel in straight lines, yet in this context it doesn't really seem to be a design property. It doesn't seem that because light rays travel in straight lines, they are necessarily designed. In the same way, sand that falls on a flat surface is going to form a nice cone, but that doesn't mean that sand falling on a flat surface was in some way designed, or that cone was in some way designed. In the same way, some people often say that the beauty or splendor of the world, that's what's designed about it. However, Dadaist poetry is considered beautiful by many, though it is created randomly by pulling words out of a hat. Jackson Pollock's paintings are considered beautiful, even though they are arguably in some way created randomly. So it seems that randomness can create beauty and splendor. It can create clear geometric figures, so it doesn't seem that either of those is sufficient to be a design-like property, R, that necessarily implies that something is shaped by intention. Premise 2. Design-like properties are not producible by natural means. Anything which exhibits R must be a product of design. Note that this is really where those previous objections would hit home here in premise 2. Because this is the strict implication. However, there's going to be some deeper problems with premise 2 as well. How could we tell that some R is present in nature, is not producible by natural means? Well, it seems we would observe nature and see if R occurred, and if it did not, we would conclude that R can't be produced by nature. However, this seems to be clear that it suffers from the problem of induction, in the same way that science suffers from the problem of induction. Let's take a look. Imagine that R only occurred naturally at a specific time, which we don't have any access to. Just because it doesn't occur anymore doesn't mean that it didn't occur. It's not necessary that the present is like the past. And perhaps R is still occurring, but somewhere that's sufficiently far away that we're unable to access it in some way. R occurred here. The world was created in whatever way, and it's continuing to occur, but it's happening at such a distance that we don't have any access to it. Or perhaps R just takes so long to occur that we've yet to observe it in the course of recorded history. Perhaps because our recorded history is such a small piece of all of the history of even just the world, if not the entire universe, that we have no access to R simply because we have no way of seeing it occur because it takes so long. An argument along these lines is going to be the argument that evolutionists offer against this design argument. For now, you don't even need to believe in evolution to doubt this argument, because you just need to say that it's possible that any of these things happen. If any of them seem possible to you, it shows that this is not a deductive premise, in the sense that the premise can't be deductively justified. It may deductively justify the rest of the argument, but this premise is only justified by induction. And as we all know, induction is problematic. So, premise 3, as we've noted, is deductively valid. It does follow from 1 and 2, even though 1 and 2 may not themselves have deductive justification. And finally, the conclusion: therefore there exists some designer that has shaped these things with intention. This does not come close to proving God. At best, it proves that something that can create design-like properties exists. Perhaps it's an alien race. Perhaps it's a large computer. It says nothing about power, knowledge, or goodness, necessarily. The point here is that even if the argument is as successful as it could possibly be, there'd be no way for it to prove God. Now, many theists at this point are going to say, well, it's just part of the many arguments to prove God, and when you look at the cosmological argument and the ontological argument and the moral argument, all these other arguments, then you'll be convinced of God's properties and all of the other things that go along with it. The problem here is all of those arguments have problems too. Check out my other series on them. The point is, you can't offer bad justification to an already poorly justified argument. If all of your support beams to build your house are broken or rotten, the house is going to fall down. And it's also a point that this doesn't avoid Hume's regress of designers. It does some things, this argument, to avoid a lot of the problems that Hume posed for the argument from analogy. However, it's not going to avoid Hume's regress of designers. So imagine that the designer itself must have some design-like properties. Therefore, the designer itself must be designed. Therefore, there exists some other designer, and so on. It would seem strange if the designer of all of reality was less complicated than what reality is, or less designed in some way than reality. That just seems very odd and very strange. So it seems like the designer, if anything possesses design-like properties, it should. And therefore, there must, by this argument, exist some other designer, and so on and so forth. So there's an infinite number of designers. Reductio ad absurdum. You have a problem. Overall, the watch argument is, in my mind, not the strongest argument that you could present. Perhaps there's some R that you can put in to make this a stronger argument. And if you have such an R, please list it in the comments below. But I haven't seen one that's sufficiently strong to support this argument. With that, we're going to go ahead and move on. We're not going to get to abductive arguments just yet. They're next up in the series. However, to talk about abduction and to talk about the cosmic fine-tuning argument, we need to talk about probability in epistemology. And when we're talking about that, we have to go through the Reverend Thomas Bayes and the Bayesians, Bayes' theorem, and Bayesian epistemology, which is where we're going to go next. Take a little sidetrack, watch those videos, and then we're going to get back to the teleological argument. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.